Welcome everyone to the 15th Annual Growing Online Learning Conference presented by Illinois Community Colleges Online. The theme for this year's conference is creating meaningful interactions in the online classroom. We hope that this year's conference offers you ideas and strategies to engage your students. I'm Jeff Newell and I'll be moderating this session. ILCO would like to thank Heartland Community College for providing the web conferencing platform for use in this year's conference. Please note the captioning is available for the conference sessions. Our schedule briefly for the 3 days is on the screen. It can also be found at the conference website at ilco.net under resources and events. Links to attend the live sessions will be found on the conference site as well, and your registration confirmation email. I do understand that some people may not have got those, but hopefully you receive the follow-up emails and everybody knows where to go. But if you have any questions about accessing the sessions, please contact me at jeff.newell@illinois.gov. Recordings of these presentations and handouts will be available at the conference site following the conference. And as a reminder, we ask everyone to stay muted during this presentation. We'll have a Q&A portion after the presentation, the main presentation occurs. At this time, ILCO is pleased to welcome Dr. Melanie Booth. She is the Vice President of Educational Programs and Engagement at NC SARA. In this role, she leads the development of educational programs and resources with and for states, institutions, and other constituents. These focus on facilitating communities of learning and practice, as well as leading the strategy for outreach, partnership support, events, writing, and communications for the organization. Prior to joining NC SARA, Melanie served as a consultant to multiple institutions of higher education, served as the founding executive director of the Quality Assurance Commons for higher and post-secondary education, and was the vice president for educational programming at WASC Senior College and University Commission. Melanie holds an ED in higher education leadership and change from Fielding Graduate University, a master's degree from San Diego State University, and a bachelor's degree from Humboldt State University. Welcome, Melanie.
Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. I'm pushing multiple buttons at one time, and I'm going to share my slides and get started here. It's nice to see so many people this morning. There we go. There we go. Okay, I think we're in good shape. Are we in good shape?
Yes, looks good. Looks great.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be with you here today to talk about this idea of Education 4.0 and today's learners. And I have so much respect for all of the work that you do. I began my career in a community college. I was in the English department, and this will tell you what innovation looked like when I began my career. There was an old business computer lab across the hall from my office that was collecting dust. And I was like, why isn't anybody using that computer lab? There's all these computers in there. Well, the software wasn't up to date and the hardware wasn't up to date, and it didn't have the latest technology for the business program. Well, I was like, well, can I use that lab? And they're, what are you talking about? I said, I want to make it into a writing lab. So that tells you when that was. And that tells you what innovation looked like, because what I did is I turned that old computer lab into a hands-on writing coaching lab, writing center, one of the earlier writing centers in that community college system. And that was even before online learning. But those students are where my heart is, and all of you who are leaders and educators for our community college students, kudos, keep up the good work. I love the theme of the conference, creating meaningful interactions in online classrooms, because really learning is a human process. And I think as we think about interactions today, we can think about teacher to student, we can think about student to student, and we can even think about interactions beyond student to student. Who do we bring into our realm? Who do we bring into our classrooms to help connect students to their next place, to their next venture? Maybe that's a job, maybe that's an internship, maybe it's just a new perspective about a complicated topic. So I think the idea of connection is key, and I will be touching on that throughout this presentation as well. The intent of this is really to share a few frameworks with all of you that I've really been working with, that I've been trying to think about how do these frameworks impact the work that we all do on behalf of our learners in post-secondary education. Are they all perfect frameworks? No. Will you have argument with them? Yes, I do. But I'm trying to kind of make some sense of them because I think there's something there. And I really appreciate kind of the global perspective of this idea of Education 4.0. So I'll share some of these frameworks. I'll ask you to kind of reflect on your practice and noodle on them and marinate on them. And maybe they will provide you with some ideas for your own practice, particularly around this idea of connecting and creating meaningful interactions. So a quick overview. I'll share with you a very high level summary of this idea of Education 4.0. We'll talk about another study, which you may have all heard about, called Learning Mindsets, and different segments of learning mindsets. I'll share with you a theoretical framework called heutagogy, which has influenced my profession and my practice for many years now. And I always like to kind of insert this and have people really think about it, because I think that it's really relevant for 21st century learning for all of us as learners and citizens in this world. And then I'll kind of bring it all together with a perspective of the 21st century educational ecosystem. So that's the roadmap, that's the plan. And at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for conversation and questions. I don't know if I can answer questions. I'm not an expert on any of this. As I said, I'll present a few ideas, a few ways of thinking about things here, and then we can kind of bring it together at the end. So what is Education 4.0? This is a initiative coming out of the World Economic Forum, and they shared this full report in 2020, mid-2022. And it's really this idea of a global need that we have in our world coming out of a traumatic pandemic. COVID-19 has impacted us globally in all sorts of different ways. And so it's really what they call a human-centric approach to recovery from this global trauma. It also takes into consideration rapid technological changes that we're all experiencing. And I just think about the Chat GPT conversation right now. I mean, that's come on board really fast. And we're all trying to make sense of it. Do we work with it? Do we push against it? Like, how do we deal with it? So these rapid technological changes are a part of this perspective of Education 4.0 as well. The other emphasis of the World Economic Forum's perspective on Education 4.0 is that it's bigger than education. Education 4.0 is one component of a broader ecosystem perspective on human thriving. And it includes health, it includes economic welfare and vitality. It includes communities that work together and create caring spaces to exist. And so I really like that the global international perspective, but also the global ecosystem perspective, because we don't teach and we don't learn in vacuums. We learn in spaces, we learn with each other, and we learn in the world in which we live. So I think as educators and leaders in your community colleges, you probably have some ideas about this, and I'll be curious to hear what you think. The framework for 4.0 is not specific to post-secondary and higher education. It really is broader than that. It really is, what do we as citizens need as learners for the 21st century coming out of this global pandemic? And so on the left side is a section of items they call content, but you'll see that they also really use the term skills. And then on the right side are ways of designing experiences, and these will all resonate with you surely. Global citizenship skills really includes this building awareness on behalf of our students of the wider world, on sustainability, and on being active in this community, active agents of change. Innovation and creativity skills includes skills required for innovation. How do you think differently about what the world needs? What problems do you want to solve? What are the new problems that we don't even know about yet? And how do we prepare our learners for those new and novel problems that will require new and novel approaches? Technology skills, as I mentioned, the framework comes out of a recognition of the rapid changes of technology, including, and I like this, digital responsibility, digital citizenship. And then interpersonal skills, because we live in a world with other people. We need to be able to work together. We need to be able to connect, and we need to be able to know how we can constructively disagree on things. And you'll see some keywords here: empathy, cooperation, negotiation, leadership, social awareness. So these are kind of the 4 large buckets. And we could all add other things to these buckets or fit things in. You know, how do we have approach to communication, critical thinking? How do we consume information? How do we make sense of this globally interconnected world with rapidly changing forces at play? On the right side, and this is my favorite side, are approaches to thinking about learning. Personalized and self-paced learning, and keep this one in mind, because this is kind of where it gets hard, but it's also where it gets kind of fun. So from a system where learning is standardized to one that's based on individual needs. And I think we're seeing some of these forces at play in our own institutions and with our own students. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about this new thing called kind of learning mindsets. Obviously accessible and inclusive, and that means accessible from a digital divide perspective. It means accessible from a universal design perspective, access to learning and inclusivity in learning. Problem-based and collaborative. We've been talking about this for years and years, but this is how the world works, right? And so I don't need to solve this problem all by myself. I have others who can be thought partners with me, who can really think this through. And so how do we help people learn how to do this? And so it becomes a process-based to a problem-based approach and requires peer collaboration. And that's a piece that I think is really helpful when we think about the theme of your conference, creating meaningful interaction. And you probably all do some form or format of that. And then this idea of lifelong and student-driven learning. One little report that I did about 5 years ago, I looked at colleges' mission statements, and they all had, and kind of like, I took a sampling across the country and different segments and sectors, community colleges, private, for-profits. Lifelong learning was a consistent theme in the mission statement. Consistent. Our institutions talk about how we do this, but this is really thinking a little bit differently about what that means for a delivery purpose, and also what it means with how we interact in our online classrooms. We can provide programming that meets people at different phases and times in their life or different needs in terms of career development, but how are we also really teaching our students and really modeling ourselves to be lifelong learners? What does that mean? What do those qualities or characteristics actually look like, and how do we know it when we see it? The report that came out of the World Economic Forum really kind of highlights 3 what they call investment areas. And so I want to talk about these very briefly, because I think that they're something to put into the marination bucket up here, right? So the first is this idea of new and improved assessment. And part of this is about assessing learning. Obviously, there's a call for kind of assessment through a lens of enabling learning to learn rather than testing recall of specific subjects or facts, involving others in assessment, such as, can we get feedback from potential employers? Can we get feedback from other learners in the classroom? And then the development of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. There's another kind of element of assessment, though, which is the bigger kind of what we might call institutional effectiveness, where we're working with better and more data, more practice, engaging with and really making meaning of our data for bettering, for helping our, at every level of our organization, really helping this model of student success become realized as much as possible. And so I always say most of the institutions I work with are data rich and information poor, lots and lots of data about students. And then how do we really stop and reflect? And it is a reflective meaning making process that we can do in collaboration. One of the things that I really appreciated about this idea of involving others in individual assessment is that it removes the teacher from being the only person with feedback and guidance and ultimately judgment on a person's learning or performance. And so this report really called upon those partnerships to help people, to help our learners really see that it's not about the grade. It's not about that final mark, but it's really about what are you able to know and do, and how do you get better at it? How do you be that learner who can continue to learn, that true lifelong learner? And how do you learn to value the feedback that you receive as part of a formative assessment process? The second area of investment called upon by the World Economic Forum is new learning technologies. And I liked this quote from the report itself, so I just stuck it in here for you all. While technology itself will not lead to better quality education, advances in educational technology can support more inclusive and skills-based learning and can help enhance educational processes. And I like this idea of leveraging technology to build resiliency in our systems, because we know that our systems will continue to be disruptive. And so how can we think about thoughtful investments in the appropriate and the kind of most effective kinds of technology for this resiliency? The other aspect of new learning technologies that the report emphasizes is kind of these areas of future growth: ubiquitous access. How do we really combat the digital divide? Collaboration and communication. We live in a human-centered world, right? So how can technology better connect communities? How can it better connect individuals? And how can it alleviate isolation? And we all had a sense of isolation in early 2020, right? So like this is, again, is coming out of this kind of collective trauma of the pandemic. The other element of this is obviously kind of educational technologies that we can use for things like experiential learning, AR, VR, the metaverse. Like we can really expand students' practice areas in certain things by really kind of taking advantage of some of these things. And it can be lower risk to try them in a virtual environment before you try them on an actual patient, for example. One of the recent studies that came out just this week from the National Skills Coalition, 92% of jobs now require digital skills. That's an increase. And so I think that one of the kind of downstream developments and opportunities, and certainly something that the World Economic Forum is pointing out here, is that not only will we need these skills, we need to continue to learn because the technology is changing so quickly. I love this third area of investment, empowerment and support for teachers, for all of us, for all of you. 4.0 really calls for investments in professional development, ongoing professional development, as well as and combined with innovative pedagogy development. So how do we really realize the return on that investment, right? Well, we realize it in terms of student outcomes, and we realize it in terms of efficacy and all of these elements. And so these really need to go hand in hand. And I'm so appreciative that this is part of the framework. So I'll have you take a look at this again, the global citizenship skills, the innovation and creativity skills, technology, interpersonal skills, and then on the right side, the approaches. And I'll have you kind of just take a moment to reflect on where in your practice can you point to, either in your individual classes or if you're instructional designers, that you're already doing a lot of this. Because I think I would wager to bet that all of you are. And I just appreciate the work that you're doing in this regard. As we move forward into kind of the next framework I'll ask you to marinate on, you'll see that this isn't about learning styles, heaven forbid. This is a new kind of a different perspective about learners' mindsets. And it really kind of takes a market perspective. And some of you may have been exposed to this framework already. This was from a summer 2021 survey by Accenture. They surveyed more than 6,500 post-secondary US learners who were aged 16 to 65. So again, wide span of learners, right? And their research went beyond student surveys to include this population of all kinds of learners, current and prospective students, those seeking degrees or certificates, and those attending or considering any type of post-education setting for whatever purpose. And so it really was a large net. And the intention of that research was to understand this kind of more market perspective or segments. I think that this is kind of interesting when I reflect on the different ways that we collect data about our students now. So the learning mindsets, I like the idea of purpose. This is what is the person's kind of purpose for engaging with post-secondary education. It's based on goals and emotions, and they're not traditional demographic factors like we collect and report to iPads, for example. So part of this research, they found that 96% of students found a high quality digital experience important to their satisfaction. This meant digital experience in all sorts of ways, what we might call kind of student services and support services to actual learning places and avenues. For every segment, learners wanted greater flexibility around the coursework modality. This was consistent across all these segments, and we'll get into the segments in a minute. And this calls upon us to think about retooling the entire learner experience by this segment, or by, again, I like this idea of purpose. Like, why do I want to have more learning right now? I've given you the source here, and I will make sure you have these slides. So there's 6 learner segments from their research, and we'll dive into them briefly here. 31% came out as what are called junior specialists, focused learners pursuing a credential to secure their first job in a specific field. Very employment-centric, economic need, and they're focused. They have this sense of a very clear outcome from their educational experience. 23% evolving professionals, early stage workers who have been successful so far, who want to expand their industry knowledge while also satisfying their intellectual curiosity. These might be degree completers. Maybe they have part of a degree or a credential or part of a stack, and they want to take it forward. 16%, a smaller percent, residential students actively participating on campus on a more traditional model, I think. Campus enthusiasts is what they called them. Wayfinding intellectuals, full-time intellectually curious students seeking to explore a broad array of disciplines. The trajectory transformers, I kind of like that idea. These are really full-time workers. They're not sure about the return on investment, but they realize that they need short, focused programs to move forward in their career and probably for economic support. And then mid-career climbers. So if you think about these segments, you'll probably recognize many of your learners in several of them and many of their purposes for being there. I put into my slides, for those of you who'd like to have them later, a little bit more from that report about each of these segments of learners, just so you can get a sense of a little bit more of an example of the kind of learners and a little bit more in depth. And I encourage you to go read the report. And again, is it the only way of thinking about our learners? No. Is it the only sense of data? No. Should we stop here? Absolutely not. But I do think it's interesting to really think about these segments of learners as we also think about what 4.0 is calling upon us as educators, as leaders in this field of online learning, around what we really need to move forward into the 21st century. So how can we think about these segments of learners and their purposes for engaging with us while also developing the lifelong learning, 21st century learning skills, knowledge, and abilities that we all are going to need as we continue into this century. Okay, brief break. We've looked at that, and I'll ask you some reflective questions. To what extent do we really know our learners and our learners' purposes? And I would propose that there's two parts to this question to reflect on. The ones that we actually serve, the reasons why they are in our classroom today. Do we know why? And the ones that we may be striving to serve in new markets, in new programs that we might be working on, in new ways of engaging students within our classrooms. And again, that theme of creating meaningful interactions. Well, what is meaningful to our students might depend on their purpose or their reason for being there. And then I think there's this idea of to what extent do our programs and practices reflect our the diversity of our learners' mindsets. So just some reflective questions to marinate on for a little bit. I'm going to take you on a very high level tour of a theoretical framework now called heutagogy. And I've been working on heutagogy for many years now. I have a colleague that I will cite here. Her name is Lisa Marie Blaschke, and she is a renowned world expert on heutagogy, among others. And it is hard to say. And I've heard it pronounced heutagogy and also heutagogy. That's up to you. Pronunciation doesn't really matter. I think what matters is that there are some perspectives of this theoretical framework that might help us really think about how we strive to reach that Education 4.0 vision. So many of you know the word pedagogy. I would venture to guess that all of you are familiar with andragogy. Think of this as a continuum: pedagogy, andragogy, heutagogy. And this, I really like this framework that Blaschke has put together because it shows kind of, it's almost like a hierarchy, right? It looks a lot like Bloom or Maslow or one of those. So it looks familiar visually, but it also talks about how it's a developmental process for learners, and that includes us, to really mature as learners and become autonomous and ultimately move from self-directedness to self-determined. And that's a big shift. And so self-directedness is a term that's associated with andragogy, where we're really thinking about adult learning and how adults differ from children, right? And there's more to andragogy than that, obviously, but we'll save that for another conversation. Heutagogy, however, moves it up a level. And you can see on the left of this slide that there, as you move toward heutagogy, learner maturity and autonomy become more important, and instructor control and course structuring becomes less important. So it's this kind of teeter-totter there. And I think our job as educators, particularly when we think about these purposes or these mindsets, is to find that balance on the teeter-totter and help our learners move toward that self-determined set of abilities, because we've talked about it. Technology is changing rapidly. I'm constantly learning new things to be able to have efficacy in my life and in my job. And so that's kind of an important framework for thinking about 21st century learning to learn. And so I always talk about moving toward a heutagogy. I don't know that we can actually have a system of higher education that totally functions, because that would imply that we don't have things like, we don't have people who are actually experts in their field who might have something to offer people, or practitioners who have the life experience or the professional experience to really understand the depth and breadth of a particular topic. But let's move to the next slide about the principles. And this book cover on the right, Unleashing the Power of Learner Agency, I'd highly recommend it. Stuart Hayes is out of Australia, and Lisa is now in Europe, and they've really come together to put these principles, to explain these principles, but also to collect really great examples from our community of practice of heutagogy around what that looks like as educators. Like, where's my role in this as an educator if I'm really focused on my learners' self-determined learning? So some of the key words or principles here: learner agency and self-efficacy. Learning to learn. This requires reflection. It requires a metacognitive approach. And we need to build this into our practice. I'm just going to stand on that soapbox and say, have we stopped to ask our learners to not only reflect on their learning processes and on their learning content or skills, but on a bigger meta perspective of how they have engaged as learners? This real sense of, we need to help people learn how to learn. The other principle is moving from skills and competencies. And we know there's lots of conversation in our ecosystem right now about skills-based hiring, about skills-based learning. But heutagogy, as we move toward it, also focuses on capabilities and capacities for learning. And again, we're moving from self-directed to self-determined. So we're helping ourselves as educators and as human beings move in that direction. The kicker for us is that learning may not be linear. We create programs often that are stackable, that are linear, but learning is often much messier than that. And I think we all know that. One of the things I wanted to kind of re-emphasize when we're talking about learning to learn and the critical role of reflection and metacognition is a key principle called double loop learning. And so this is really about, again, reflecting on the learning experience itself and saying that learning in and of itself is an experience worth reflecting on that we can learn from. So I think just having our learners really stop and have that conversation, and again, the conversation with us, but maybe with each other, maybe with others, and maybe even reflecting on it in their other lives outside of our classrooms, right? Like, what does learning look like as a parent? What does learning look like as a nurse practitioner? What does learning look like as a welder? What does learning look like as a whatever? So that we can kind of help them take perspective on learning as an activity that is worthwhile and as an activity that we learn how to do better. And so I love this concept of kind of bettering out of that. David Bowd, who's one of my favorite kind of theoretical people who had a lot of work in Australia on credit for prior learning or prior learning recognition, talks about reflection is the process by which experience is turned into learning. So that's just a really critical part of how we build that connectedness, how we build that efficacy. The nonlinear learning I want to talk about really briefly before we kind of wrap up here and have a conversation. When we talk about nonlinear learning, and I think we're seeing this as we look at the swirling demographics of our students, part of it might be because of necessity. They have other obligations. It may not be practical or reasonable for them to start here and end here and do these 5 things in between. But part of it, I think, could be based on the context of 21st century life. I need to learn this right now for this, that just-in-time aspect. And how do I situate that in a bigger process and bigger perspective? And so when we talk about kind of moving toward heutagogy, the path may not be actually prescribed or defined by us as educators. The learners are going to want to have more agency in this. And so it becomes complicated when we think about our regulatory environment and our accreditation environment and all of the necessary elements to design a program when we're trying to balance that. So again, I think of it as kind of a teeter-totter. Where do we find that sweet spot? Can we know enough about our learners' mindsets or their purposes to be able to really find that balancing point and to be able to help really develop these kind of mindsets and 21st century ideas for Education 4.0 and for our collective development and recovery. Okay. So we'll look one more time at Education 4.0, really kind of give it a little bit more thought. And then I'd like to try to kind of pull it all together. I see some things in the chat. Let me stop for just a moment here and make sure what I'm looking at. Ken says we need to ensure students acquire the confidence and motivation. Yes, thank you. Motivation is key. And oftentimes I think learners are like, I want the short-term nugget. But that kind of a whole motivation after leaving the course, have we inspired them to learn and to continue learning? Is that our job? I'm going to say it is. And Anna is sharing notes. Thank you very much for both of you for those comments. Helpful. All right, let me move chat out of my way as I reorganize my screen. Here's a way I'm thinking about how this all comes together and what this might mean. First of all, I think there's a question. There's a question for all of us to think about. As we think about moving toward heutagogy, as we think about the knowledge, skills, and abilities that people, that we all need in the 21st century, as we think about the demands on us as humans, the global demands on us environmentally, coming out of our collective trauma, all that's going on in the world, what constitutes student success accordingly? How do we know it when we see it? For those of you who work in assessment like me, this is a really important question that you probably ask all the time. How do we know it when we see it? How do we assess this kind of learning? Peter Ewell, who's one of my mentors, calls this the spookies, or the things that are really hard to get at sometimes in our traditional assessment systems. But remember, Education 4.0 is calling upon us to think about assessment a little bit differently. Think about assessment as feedback, as formative, as developmental. The framework I think of is 3 kinds of assessment. There's assessment of learning, and that might be in the form of, tell me what you know, tell me what you can do. There's assessment as learning, and there's assessment for learning. And those middle prepositions might change our perspective. Do we need to look at student outcomes? Absolutely, 100%. Do we need to have mechanisms built in for rolling that data up into institutional effectiveness considerations? Absolutely, 100%. Can we also recognize the genuine importance of formative, developmental, human-based feedback and interaction and peer review and connectedness that helps better learning, we absolutely need to do that. And so bots aren't going to do it. Chat GPT isn't going to do it. We have to do it. We're humans, and humans learn in human context. So back to our theme, meaningful interactions in the online classroom. We got to interact, right? And not just interact us as instructors with them, but also students to students and the broader world. Bring them into your classroom. All right, final idea. And then I'm happy to open up the chat and have some interaction here. We can do it verbally, we can do it through chat, whatever works. An ecosystem perspective. I have a really good friend from college, actually, who is a specialist in Pacific Northwest salmon. He lives in Washington. He works on the rivers. When he started his career as a fisheries biologist, about 25, 30 years ago now, he said to me, I studied fish. I looked at fish. I looked at their scales. I looked at their innards. I looked at the fish. What color were they? How were they breathing? You know, how were they getting upstream? He said, then my experience and my mentors and my education broadened that. I had to start looking at the streams. So I moved from studying the fish to studying the stream. What's happening with the water quality? What's happening with the bugs in the streams? What are the frogs doing in the streams? What's coming into the streams, and where are the streams going, and how are the streams themselves changing? And then he said, I got deeper into my career and I realized that I needed to look broader than that to understand my specialization of the salmon, right? So I need to look at the entire ecosystem, the water flow from the dams, the political perspective of damming rivers in the first place. All of that ecosystem had to be considered and is part of his mindset now as a specialist about a particular fish. And I really appreciated that conversation with him because I think it really exemplifies all that we're trying to do in our classrooms and in our meaningful engagements with students. How do we help them see the tree, help them see the forest, and that there's a canopy perspective? And I would call upon us as educators to do that as well. What is happening in our ecosystem that is impacting our practice, and that we need to kind of say, oh, I might want to change this a little bit. Do we need to do it all force at once? Absolutely no. Incremental changes and studying those changes are part of that pedagogical innovation. So I think the ecosystem right now, and many of you are probably leading these conversations, are, as I kind of already mentioned, we're talking about skills, right? Skills-based hiring, skills-based learning. How are we moving from content to skill development? And we're talking about employability skills, communication, critical thinking, problem solving, interpersonal abilities, cultural awareness, and competencies. We're talking about employability and moving our programs to ensure employability outcomes, to look at return on investment, right? That's part of our ecosystem. My particular soapbox, all learning counts. Why do we not count all the learning that people have? We have mechanisms for this now. We don't value it. Until we value the learning that people are bringing with them, and sometimes do we need to reframe that learning and help them think differently about it? Absolutely, but we have to start by valuing it. Complex problems to solve that don't exist yet, novel problems, novel technologies. We've probably, many of you have heard the word agile thinking and agility and adaptability. Again, 92% of the jobs out there today require digital skills, right? And so we're, like all of you experts, are best positioned to help develop that because you're teaching digitally and you're developing these digital skills just by methodology. Capability development. Learning to learn is going to be the most important ability knowledge, skill, and ability for the 21st century. It is primary on the list from my perspective, my opinion. And again, it calls upon us to think about assessment differently and to think about that collaboration and communication and double loop learning opportunities within our online classrooms. So I would say, even if you don't agree with Education 4.0, or even if you aren't sure I like this idea of learning mindsets or purposes of students, or you might want to take up argument with the methodology of the study, I would offer them to you as frameworks to think about as you move your practice forward. And as leaders in this field, I'm so grateful for all the work that you do on behalf of your learners and all the kind of real significant life-changing forces that you help initiate. So with that, I will stop, and I see there's a note in the chat, and I think we have about a few minutes for questions or conversation that we can have. And I'll ask Jeff to kind of help me navigate who might like to say something or put something in the chat. I'll start with what's in the chat. Oh, there's a note of thanks for Anna's note taking, and I will share my slides. So thank you.
Thank you,
I'm
Melanie.
done talking now.
Yeah, at this time, anyone, if you have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask that live or post something in the chat.
Hello, my name's Ken Mellendorf. I teach at Illinois Central College, a community college in the middle of Illinois.
Hi, Ken.
Hi, and I find a lot of the publications and a lot of what my college talks about is focused on courses that would be in the first semester or first year of college and leaning more towards general education courses. I teach introductory calculus-based physics, which is literally the launching point for almost every major in engineering, physical sciences, and technology, and has to provide all these students with the ability to understand every teacher that follows. If they don't have the ability to conceive of, to develop their own awareness of, and then apply what comes out of my course, they will not understand the teachers in the next courses. So what I teach, the content, is set by the programs that they follow into, not by me. And
prerequisite learning, right? Prerequisite learning.
Very prerequisite, because if they don't know how to think about something such as energy, which does not have any words to define it, they have to develop their own concept of it. I can't tell them what it is. If they don't develop that, then in many fields which use energy, they won't know how to communicate with those who are talking about energy.
Yeah.
And that's
well, I think this is the teeter-totter. I'm not sure. I appreciate that, because you are bringing up a really important perspective about there's some knowledge that we have to have before we can build as building blocks, right? And so what we've done in our higher education system is called that you need that knowledge. Here it is in a package. It's prerequisite to the next package, Absolutely. And do students have an opportunity along that path to reconnect and reflect and do that double loop back to that? That takes a little more. You can package the content and you can talk about it from a prerequisite standpoint. And I absolutely agree. I come from a humanities background, taught writing and critical thinking and all these kinds of classes for years. And I kind of needed them to know some things before they could move to, their building blocks. Absolutely. And I think we can think about the opportunities to build across programs the development of these kinds of meta skills or meta perspectives and awarenesses. The systems we're in and the systems that we might create and perpetuate will impact that. They're limiters, right? There's only so much we can do as individual instructors, but I think even within our individual classes, we can think about moving that needle, moving toward it. And can we work with each other to think about where the opportunities are and work with our students? Like, oh my gosh, I'm sure you know, they have very informed perspectives about their learning when you ask them. So ask them, like, how would this work better? Like, how, if you were to sequence this differently now that you're at the end of it, or now that if you're bringing in some experience where you're already working with energy, what does it look like in your field? That's my response. It's a great question, because we do work within these structures, and there are structures there for a reason.
Yeah, because being at a community college, it has to be transferable to the four-year colleges and accepted by the four-year colleges.
And recognizable, right?
Yes, and so what
our
I
students
use,
need to recognize it.
and I might put it in a different order if it was the last class the students were going to take. But there's, what I like to include is giving students the skills to create their own images of what these things are, because most things in physics do not have words.
Yeah.
The words have never been invented. I can use calculus as a language, not as a tool to find answers, but as a way to talk about things.
Well, even
There's
that
no real
perspective.
words for it.
Yeah, and I think even that perspective right there probably helps students see, why am I in this class differently? You know, we're learning a language so that we can have a conversation about these properties that impact us on a daily basis. You will experience these properties driving from point A to point B every day. So let's learn about them. Ken, thank you for that comment, and that a bit of a conundrum, right? I appreciate that. We work and we live in places of conundrums, and we need to, how can we collectively work together to move move the needle, baby steps, as I say. Great comment.
We have about 5 minutes left. Does anybody else have any questions that they'd like to bring forward?
Or comments on the frameworks? I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on them. I'm just working with them and marinating on them myself.
All right. Well, I'm gonna. Do you have any final words? Otherwise, I'll just wrap us up.
I don't. I appreciate all of you coming together for this very important work that you're doing together. Paula is asking, where do you go to learn more about Education 4.0 and related topics? I will share my slides, and they have links on them. Heutagogy, there's a pretty large community of practice. There's several books and texts. Many of them are OER. Because the people practicing heutagogy don't want to lock them down. And so that book that I just had on the slide is an OER, and I'll make sure that the links are available to you when I share the resources. And I'd love to continue the conversation. If any of you are interested, feel free to reach out, and my contact information will be on the slides as well. I thank you for your time.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Booth. Let's give her a round of thanks and applause in the chat with text or a reaction. We do appreciate you taking the time to be here today and to kick our conference off. I want to let everybody know that we'll have a conference evaluation that we'll send out following the conference. It'll come into your email, and so please be on the lookout for that. And a reminder that our session this afternoon at 2:00 Central is regular and substantive interaction, a self-checklist for faculty presented by Robin Fish from Sauk Valley Community College. And links to attend the live sessions are on the conference website and also in your registration email. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I am Jeff Newell at jeff.newell@illinois.gov. And recordings of these presentations and handouts will be available on the conference site at ilco.net following the conference. So thank you everybody for attending today, and thank you again to Dr. Booth, and we wish you a good day, and we will see you at 2:00. Thank you.